Thanks for joining me, Madam Horror, for your bedtime scary stories. If you have a story you would like read on this channel, send it to me at madamhorror1@gmail.com. Hit the like and subscribe buttons, and we'll dive deeper into the unknown. Tonight, Tales of Black-Eyed Children. My encounter with the Black-Eyed Kids happened Halloween 1990. I was 13 years old at the time. A little backstory on me at the time. I was a teen that was bullied by both boys and girls and had no friends. Also had to fight off both boys and girls if I was attacked. So I learned at a young age that showing no fear worked well with most of my peers. Knowing that may help you understand my reaction to them and how I acted. The street I lived on never received many trick-or-treaters. Nevertheless, I turned on the light on the built-in porch light and gave out candy to the few that did stop by. Back then, you could trick-or-treat till 9 p.m., I think. That year, there was even less kids that came by. It was in the last 30 minutes that I heard a knock at the door. I walked right out there and opened up the porch door and saw 3 kids, one looking 5 or 6, another 11 or 12, and an older one looking 15 or 16. I did notice how strange they looked, but it was Halloween and I really thought it was great makeup. I even complimented them on how real they looked. They all have a plastic bag they were holding. I go and put candy in each of their bags. I noticed that the bags were empty and only had what I put in them. I did find this strange since it was the end of the night and not much time left to get candy. So I gave them more candy in their bags and they looked down at it, then looked right back up at me. I got hit with an energy like I was under threat. But I felt that all that time from other kids, so I still stand there showing no fear. One asked to use the phone. I said I had to ask my mom because my parents did not like people coming to the house to use the phone. I started yelling for my mom. As I do this, they keep asking to use the phone. This goes on for a few minutes until my mom comes walking onto the porch. She took one look and screamed, "Becky, shut the door!" I was shocked at first by her reaction, but I went to shut the door. At that moment, the oldest and biggest one grabbed the porch door handle and started pulling against me, hard, to swing open the door. I keep my grip as my mom is still screaming behind me. She was a person that freezes and panics, so she was no help with the struggle with the door. I kept yelling back at her that I was trying. As a tug of war is happening at the door, they start saying, "Let us in." At that point, I grabbed a hold of my wrist with my other hand and pulled as hard as I could with both arms, and I pulled the handle out of his hand. I locked the porch door, and my mom grabbed my arm and pulled me into the house, slammed and locked the door, closed the shades, and turned off the porch light. I was like, "What the heck?" to my mom. She yelled at me that they were not human and had black eyes. I said, "But it's Halloween." And she said, "You cannot do that with makeup." I sat down on the couch, pretty much in shock that I was out there talking to them like they were human. They stayed out in front of the porch with the lights off for about an hour. My mom kept looking out, screaming at them to go away. Finally, we looked out and they were gone. My mom and I never talked about this again. She had already passed before I saw accounts of the Black-Eyed Kids, so I never got to tell her what we had an encounter with. I'm a single dad, and my ex doesn't take as much part in our daughter's life as she's legally bound to. But rather than cause unnecessary drama for my daughter, I try to be flexible. Her mom's not a bad person, just really scatterbrained and selfish at times. For that reason, I have primary physical custody. My ex finally wanted to see my daughter, so I drove her to her mother's apartment. It's about a half-hour drive from my house. My daughter was sort of acting like a brat, like I was forcing her to go to her mom's. But I knew that they would be happy once she landed, and they would have a girls' night, because my ex tries to make up for her absences, and they would talk about all the preteen stuff my daughter was going through. I realize that her mom is more of a friend than anything, like a cool older sister. I try to make up for it by being the true parent figure, but sometimes my daughter is just mad at both of us. Who could blame her? Divorce is the devil. I drove back home on a dark, dead county route. I was driving my 1970 tan Chevy Impala, a car I've maintained since my dad gave it to me when I was about 19. I was cruising, the windows down, listening to the night. That's when I spotted someone standing on the tree line on the side of the road. I wouldn't have spotted her if I hadn't been driving relatively slow with the windows down and no music. Her hair was just like an afro, with strands that stuck out all over, and her clothes didn't fit correctly, like her jeans were high waters. She looked like she'd just crawled out of the woods. Immediately, I thought of my daughter. They even looked around the same age. I pulled over and called out of the passenger window. "Hey, you okay?" For a moment, she stood there, saying nothing. Then she started to sway slightly back and forth. "Can I come in?" I told her, sure, I could give her a ride someplace. Why was she out here in the dark at night? And where were her parents? She replied, "Can I use your phone?" She opened the passenger door and slid into the seat. At that moment, a sickening feeling took me over. I was terrified and wanted this girl out of my car. But at the same time, my head was buzzing, and I just had to help her. I looked into her horrible, black eyes and handed her my phone. I started driving, and instead of her calling her parents or someone for help, she just held it. And I just kept driving. I think I intended to bring her back to my home, even though my head was swimming and my gut instinct was telling me to physically boot her out of the car. We drove in silence, her black eyes pinned on me the entire time. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I see her lean toward me and open her mouth. She released a little hiss and leaned further in toward my arm. I yanked my arm away, making a swerve across the opposite lane of traffic, which could have been disastrous if it were daytime. I threw the car into park and jumped out of the car, swiping at my skin and clothes as if I'd just walked through a spider web. I just could not escape this sickly, creepy feeling. The girl stayed in the car, motionless, staring at me and holding my phone. I gave myself a good shake and started walking in the direction of my house, still about 2 miles away. The entire time I glanced over my shoulder, and until she was out of sight, she was still sitting in my car. My girlfriend was nervous when I got home. She had been calling me, worried where I'd been. I couldn't tell her what happened, not because I didn't want to, but because I physically couldn't. I went to bed, and when I woke up, sickly feeling was gone. My girlfriend drove me to get my car, and the black-eyed girl was gone, my phone in the passenger seat. I swore never to help strangers on the side of the road again. A few years back, I traveled to Shenandoah National Park in Virginia with my girlfriends. There were 4 of us, all in our late 20s, early 30s, and all full of conversation and ideas. One hike we went on was downhill to a small but beautiful waterfall. On our way out of the waterfall, we found a dead, decaying animal. We all gathered around its little body and inspected it. L and B examined its physicality, trying to figure out what it was. We eventually realized it was a possum, and me and D were trying to figure out if we could salvage some bones for souvenirs. just to give an idea of the type of people we are. When we're together, we are inquisitive, investigative, and it feels great to have a group of friends that are as weird as you are. We rented a cabin outside the park that was up a steep, deeply potholed and eroded road that could not have been navigated without four-wheel drive. Thank God Bee drove us in her Jeep because we would not have made it otherwise. There was one other cabin up this road that we could see, but the area was incredibly overgrown. We called the cabin Daddy Longleg Den. The front door was swarmed with them, and they crawled out of the shower drain. I know it's irrational, but I am utterly terrified of Daddy Longlegs. Between that and the overgrown forest that grew upward and consumed the cabin, the place had a creepy vibe, but we embraced it. We had finished a hike of Stony Man and Hawksbill, about 13 miles out and back, about a 7-hour hike. We headed back to the cabin, starving, and made a huge batch of tacos. We rolled a Jimmy thing, and L and B had some hard seltzer. Our muscles were wobbly from the exercise, and we chowed down. It got darker, and we got looser from the wine and the Jimmy thing. We were totally in our vibes. Then a knock came at the door. B literally jumped. We all paused and looked at each other. Who the heck would be up the crazy, eroded, overgrown road in the middle of the night and knocking on the door of a group of women? Dee put on her brave face and marched right to the door before we could stop her. She didn't even look out the window to see who was there. The door flung open to show 3 kids on the front step. They all wore dirty hoodies and stood as still as stone. Dee asked them what they wanted, and the tallest kid spoke. "Please, we got separated from our dad on a hike. Can we use your phone?" There was something off about the way he spoke. Like the cadence was off, almost like AI trying to imitate a human. Dee immediately reached in her pocket to hand them her phone, but Elle and I rushed forward. Elle and I met working in a psychiatric hospital, and we knew not to dismiss strange behaviors. Who was to say these kids weren't trying to rob us, or that their supposed dad was lurking in the trees to rob us as well? "We have no service," Elle told them. "Sorry." The 3 children were silent, but the little ones began to sway ever so slightly where they stood. "Let us in," the tallest stated. Then, in unison, the 2 little kids stated, "We don't want to sleep outside in the dark." From behind us, B spoke up. "Just let them in, they're kids." At that, the tallest stepped forward. The only thing blocking him from entering were the bodies of me, D, and L. When he moved, he stepped into the porch light, and I saw a glimpse of his face. Pale, lifeless, with huge black eyes, as if his pupils were so dilated they consumed the entire eye. I pushed D out of the way and slammed the door. B was protesting. She couldn't understand why we wouldn't let some lost kids into our house. Then we heard the scratching. It came from the southern wall of the house. Just to be clear, the cabin was built on an incline, so this wall of the cabin was about 14 feet in the air, the house supported by beams beneath it. It sounded like a great, clawed beast was crawling along the side of the house. For clarity, there was a balcony on the eastern side of the house that was not accessible from the outside. No stairs, nothing, just a sliding door from inside the kitchen. B screamed. Suddenly, the 2 smaller children clambered over the railing onto the big wooden balcony. Their hoods had fallen back, showing their odd, almost waxen faces and black, lifeless eyes. They began banging their heads against the glass of the sliding door. "Let us in! Let us in!" they chanted. Behind us, the front door knob was rattling, followed by huge thumps. It sounded like the taller kid was trying to break down the door. Elle darted forward and grabbed the knob, leaning all her weight against it. B, and I grabbed couches and furniture to block the sliding door. Then we split. Two at the front door, two at the sliding door, crying and praying that these little monsters couldn't break into our cabin. And do what? Hurt us? Kill us? We didn't know, and we didn't want to find out. The kicker was we truly had terrible service in that cabin, but suddenly, the 911 emergency function wouldn't work either. After what felt like forever, the pounding died down. When we worked up the courage to check, it seemed the children had gone. Still, we decided to sleep all together in the living room, just to be safe. The next morning, the sun rose and the events of the night before felt surreal. If we haven't confirmed with each other that, yes, strange children did show up at our door, and, yes, they wanted into the cabin. Instead of staying the final night, we packed up, then headed home. I haven't had any experiences since then, and if my friends have, they sure aren't talking about it. I knew from that point on I would never visit Shenandoah again. Back in the early 2000s, when I was in high school, my parents went away for a few days and let me house sit. I was pretty stoked because I had the whole house to myself. Instead of throwing a party like a lot of kids would do, I was excited to eat pizza every night and not be nagged about school. One night, I was in the living room, up way later than my mom would have permitted, even though I was in my teens, eating leftovers from my last Domino's order. All of a sudden, I hear a sharp knock on the window. Now, my parents had lots of windows in their house, and I didn't close the curtains at night because we lived in a pretty rural area with a private backyard. I jumped and looked over at the window to find a girl standing on the other side waving. At first, I thought it might be the girl I liked, but that was stupid, wishful thinking. The girl I liked was a redhead, and this girl had frizzy brown hair, and she kept waving her hand back and forth slowly, like an automatron. I cracked the window and asked her what she wanted. "Is it safe in there?" she asked. I didn't know what she meant, and I couldn't recognize her in the dark. So I replied, "Do you go to my high school name here?" She nodded, yes. I asked her what year she was in, and she replied by asking again, "Is it safe in there?" I told her I didn't know what she meant, and she told me it wasn't safe outside. Thing was, she didn't exactly sound scared. If anything, she sounded dazed. I kept trying to place her, just kind of stuck looking at her face in the shadows. But her features were kind of hard to pin down. I didn't go to a big high school, so it would have been odd if I didn't at least kind of recognize her. And I didn't. After a minute, she said, "Let me in. It's not safe out here." Safe from what? What's out there? She didn't tell me, just kept repeating, "Let me in. It's not safe." Then just, "Let me in. Let me in." I hated to think of this random girl out there in the dark down this rural road, but I just muttered, I don't know if I can." Then she looked to her left. My heart jumped into my throat. The back door was open, with only the screen door closed. I raced to the back door and shut it and locked it just as she was opening the screen door. I flipped on the outside light, thinking I would tell her I'd throw a phone out to her to call for help, but I didn't even get to offer. As I flicked on the light, I saw her black, void-like eyes. Thinking automatically of vampires, I told her, "You cannot come inside." She wasn't a vampire, not that I knew anyway, but at that she backed away from the door. I don't know how long I got stuck again, just staring at her odd, unfamiliar face. Then she just left. I went from window to window in the house, trying to keep her in my sights. She wandered down the road until I couldn't see her anymore, and I never saw her again after that. Let me start by setting the stage for this encounter that happened a few years ago. It was Christmas night, and I work at a decent-sized factory in New England as a security guard for the night shift. The factory was built in 1900 and is located at the end of a residential suburban street, which was common for the time. Being as it was Christmas night, all other employees and guards but myself were home for the holidays, as I sat at the security office, which is detached from the main building next to the gate. At around 2 a.m., I looked up from the computer monitor to see 3 girls on the younger side, maybe 12 or 13, about 20 yards away, standing at the telephone pole, staring directly at me. It's not uncommon to see children in this area since it's a neighborhood, but at 2 a.m. on Christmas night, come on. I tried to ignore it and continued to look down at the computer monitor until only about 20 seconds later, I look up, startled, to hear tapping on the locked office door. And you guessed it, it was the girls. I'm confused and nervous as the girls just start giggling. "Can I help you?" I raise my voice. They stood there with an evil grin on their pale faces. "Let us in," they said. Their eyes were completely black, and this threw me. At this point, I was speechless. My heart just sank, realizing how creepy the situation was. I told them to go away with a stern voice, and got up and shut the lights off. No sooner did I sit down, they were right back where they had started, by the telephone pole, looking at me with an emotionless face, and in the next moment, they were gone. I watched the cameras for hours after seeing this just to see if they showed up again. As you can imagine, I didn't leave the guardhouse until morning. They might have only been young girls, but something about them did not seem right. It almost felt like a dream. I woke up to my dog, Lucy, barking. She was upright on the bed where my husband and I were sleeping, with our 22-month-old daughter, staring at our door like an unknown stranger was out there rummaging around. I thought she was just freaking out over a house noise. We'd only had her for 3 months, and she was still a puppy. It could have been anything. Our roommate, a creak from the house settling, the awnings moving outside in the breeze. I wasn't too concerned initially. I decided the best bet would be to open the door and show her that nothing was there. It sounds a little bit silly, but it's what we do with our daughter when she gets scared, and I figured it would work with the puppy too. I opened the door and she raced to it. She stood there, snarling. It was an angry, violent growl, one I had never heard her make before. I looked groggily at her and opened the baby gate, blocking the doorway, planning to open the door and show her that everything was okay. The second my hand reached for the deadbolt, Lucy went wild. She started barking and jumped towards me, and when I touched the metal, she suddenly changed her temper. She whimpered, almost like she was afraid and backing down. As her mannerism changed, so did mine. I wasn't calm anymore. My heart was racing and sinking at the same time. I had been flooded with a mixture of fear and dread. I looked through the peephole. I can't explain why I looked, but I did. Outside were 2 kids. One was just a smidgen shorter than me, and didn't look much younger. I'm 21, and she looked to be 16 or 17. She was slender and pale. Her hair was a light shade of honey blonde, and she wore it long, about mid-back, with long, thin, blunt bangs in the front that covered most of her eyes. She wore jeans, a light wash that's popular right now, and a thin-looking olive-covered pullover-style hoodie. She held the hand of a small girl who looked to be around 3 or 4 in the same style jeans and a button-down ivory cardigan. The smaller one looked at the floor shyly, but had the same shade of hair tied back in a ponytail. She held a stuffed toy under her free arm, and it was identical to one my daughter has, as was the style of dress. Had it not been the feeling of overwhelming dread and fear that stopped me, I probably would have asked these children in and given them some tea or hot chocolate. Something about them seemed off. At this point, I hadn't made any noise. I had never followed through with opening the deadbolt. I hadn't shushed the dog or grumbled. Nothing. I hadn't turned on any lights, so these kids had no indication that I was at the door. And yet the older one spoke. She had a voice that was mature, confident, strong. She held her head tilted downward, and I couldn't see her eyes. She said, "We have to use your phone." I stood frozen in fear. How did she know I was there? She raised her eyes to face me directly through the peephole, and that's when I saw them. There was a reason I couldn't see them through her bangs before. They were black or midnight blue or maybe a dark, dark purple. They were otherworldly. She said, "Our mother is worried." As someone who's always been interested in creepy stories, I knew what she was the second she looked at me through the door. I've never been one to believe in these things. As a staunch atheist and skeptic when it comes to the paranormal, I had written off many a ghost story from friends and family members eager to tell their tale, and I didn't believe it. Still, I couldn't rationalize my way out of this. I was standing with nothing but a thin wooden door between me and the black-eyed kid. There was no questioning what was right in front of me. I did not answer her. Slowly and silently, I backed away from the door. Lucy still cowered at my ankles. She kept talking. "Just let us use your phone." I took another step back, and with that, the tone changed. I was standing with nothing but a thin wooden door between me and the black-eyed kid. There was no questioning what was right in front of me. I did not answer her. Slowly and silently, I backed away from the door. Lucy still cowering at my ankles. She kept talking. "Just let us in to use your phone." I took another step back, and with that, the tone changed. At first, she seemed polite. When I took that second step back, she became commanding, almost hostile. "We are not going to hurt you. If we wanted to do that, we would have broken in. I'll ask again. May we come in and use your phone?" Lucy snarled at the door, and I inched backward, though something inside me seemed to be slowly pulling me back toward the door. It wasn't a physical pull so much as a subconscious need to go back and let them in. I got to my room, covered up the window, locked the door, and sat there in the dim of the nightlight. I heard her call me back to the door once more, and then quiet. I didn't go back to sleep that night, and I haven't slept right since. I know from reading about the black-eyed kids that they can't just come in without permission. I know they haven't hurt anyone, but I still fear that I will be the exception. When I told my husband, he said it was just a dream. He keeps telling me to forget it, but this lingering feeling of sadness, this dread when the house is silent at night, this fear of a knock at the door, this tells me otherwise. I was riding the bus back home after work. It was about 1 a.m. I'm a security guard, and I often work odd hours. So I'm sitting there, and this guy gets on and sits across from me. He's wearing a suit and had a briefcase, regular-looking guy in his 20s. What struck me about him at first was that he was chewing a cigar, but not smoking it. He can't smoke on the bus, just chewing it. So I was just looking at him while he was staring out the window and chewing on a cigar, and all of a sudden he turned and looked at me, and his eyes were pitch black. My heart started beating like mad, and I felt bile rising. I wanted to vomit. I was starting to panic, and I had no idea why. I was just terrified of this guy. And then he grinned at me, and his teeth were all covered in tobacco bits and brown juice, the cigar clamped between them. And I almost screamed, but instead I had the presence of mind to just get up and take the seat right behind the driver. I calmed down a little bit after that, but I kept an eye on the guy. He ended up chatting with some girl that got on, and they were still talking when I got off the bus. I later convinced myself that he was just trolling me and having fun with a pair of contacts, but now I wonder. I hope you enjoyed tonight's scary stories. If you did, remember to hit the like and subscribe buttons. If you have a story that you would like read on this channel, please send it to me at madamhorror1@gmail.com. Join me next time for more tales of the unknown.